Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is my last talk at DevWeek for now. I hope you've been enjoying everything so far. It's, I think, a pretty good idea that they kept this talk for last. It kind of helps build closure for this conference and prepare the ground for the next one, where we're probably going to be talking a lot about what it means for .NET, the new open source era for .NET, .NET Core, Core CLR, where Microsoft is going. It's all very, very early now. And I hope to give you some ground for exploration in the coming year. And then I'll see you here in March next year. And hopefully you'll be able to share some very cool stuff that you built on top of this new open sourced .NET. The title is an open source .NET, and I built this as a story of 19 questions and answers. They're not all particularly exciting, these questions, but the answers are pretty interesting. And I also have a few demos which were rather hard to build, showing how we can take the bits Microsoft just put on GitHub, compile, build, test, and run our own .NET, our own CLR, our own diagnostic tools for that CLR. And that's all very, very exciting, but it's also very, very early, like I said. So if anything goes wrong, it's not even preview software. It's much earlier than preview. So it couldn't be more raw than it is right now. That's just the early warning. My name is Sasha Goldshtein. Some of you have already been at one of my talks earlier. And if you'd like to stay in touch, then please feel free to ask any questions during the session. Afterwards, shoot me an email, follow me on Twitter, read my blog. I expect to do a lot around this open source .NET stuff in the coming year. So the first question is, what am I talking about? What open source .NET? If you have been living under a rock for the last 5 months, you might have missed the important announcements. And so in November, Microsoft announced that they are open sourcing .NET Core, which is something that never existed, so it was kind of weird that they open sourced it. But they made up a product called .NET Core, and then they announced they're going to open source it. And they made up another product called Core CLR, and announced they're going to open source that as well. Now, the .NET Core is something you might think of as the .NET framework, but I will explain that it's not quite the same thing you're used to calling the .NET desktop framework. And Core CLR is the runtime for that framework. And again, it's not quite what you know today as the desktop CLR, the one you have on your desktop. It's not just open source, though, that was interesting in this announcement. Microsoft also announced that they are planning to invest resources on building both .NET Core and Core CLR on other platforms. So bringing it to Linux, bringing it to OS X, and to other platforms potentially as well. So not just releasing this thing and letting other people take care of porting, but actually investing their own resources in porting .NET Core and Core CLR to other platforms. And in fact, as you'll see today, the Microsoft-enabled support is pretty much enough to compile, build, and run your own CLR on OS X, and that's exactly what I'm planning to do. There is also already some community involvement, which I'll talk about later. So people are getting interested, people are contributing code, and Microsoft are taking that code and using it. So it's not your typical move by Microsoft when they take a huge chunk of code and just drop it to GitHub twice a year, or drop it to Codeplex, more reasonably, drop it to Codeplex twice a year. It's a totally different approach this time. And they're actually making commits in the open. So you can see, as the day progresses in Redmond, you can see multiple commits pile up. There are branches that you can see visible in the open. Feature work is happening on those branches. So it's not a project where once a year someone drops new 200,000 lines of code that you have to go through. And from that perspective, it is in fact more open than almost anything Microsoft has done before. And they're planning to keep it up that way. The other thing is that, like I've said, it's truly cross-platform, so they're not really just dropping support for dropping code with support for Windows and expecting people to take care of other platforms. They are, like I said, actively investing in other platforms. And finally, it's really community-driven, so they are expecting people to contribute. And obviously, at this point, most work on the CLR and the .NET Core is by Microsoft developers, but it isn't by any means a closed community. And people are expected to contribute, and they have been. And I'll show you some really interesting contributions along the way. Is this the first time Microsoft has ever done open source, or is this like a totally new experiment for them? What do you think? No. What's that? What's that?
SignalR.
SignalR was open sourced, okay. Anything even earlier, maybe? When was ASP.NET MVC open sourced? It was. And it was open sourced a while ago. ASP.NET MVC4 was open sourced. Entity Framework 6 is open source. MEF, Managed Extensibility Framework, is open source for a few years now. The Azure SDK client libraries in C#, Python, and JavaScript, they are all open source on GitHub for a while. The Roslyn compiler platform and the C# and VB compilers are open source for a few months now. Used to be on Codeplex, they are now on GitHub. And here's the recent announcement. MS Build has been open source for a week and a half now. Not the most exciting piece of software they could open source, but it's nice to have. And the Windows Driver Foundation is open source now on GitHub. And that's by a totally different team on a totally different side of Microsoft, and it's also going open source. So the Windows kernel is not open source. The Windows operating system is not open source, but Windows Driver Framework is a pretty important component which used to be obviously closed, and Microsoft just recently announced that they are open sourcing it as well. And I think this also aligns with things we've been seeing over the last few years, where Microsoft has sort of started to connect to the open source community and connect to the community in general. For instance, if you look at Azure, Microsoft have Linux support on Azure for a while, for Linux virtual machines, but only during the last 2 or 3 years, they really care about this support. And by really care, I mean they want people to use Linux. They want people to use Linux and not Windows. I mean, they wouldn't mind if you used Windows and paid the extra licensing fees, but they really don't mind if you use Linux for everything. And you can run Java on Azure websites, for example, for quite a few months now. Another example of trying to be open and often succeeding. And so this whole open source thing just fits really well into that movement, and MEF was sort of the pioneer there. Glenn Block, who's formerly of Microsoft, worked a lot on making Microsoft a better place for open source and for taking community contributions. Now, I mentioned that .NET Core is not exactly what you'd probably think of when you say .NET Framework. And so what I'd like to ask you now is there really such a thing, a .NET Framework, the .NET Framework? What does it really mean, a .NET Framework? Maybe there are multiple .NET Frameworks. Can you give me a few? Does anyone have more than one .NET Framework in mind? Yes? Micro Framework? So we have the .NET Micro Framework, and we have the Desktop Framework, I suppose, for the other. What's that? And Compact Framework as well. Yep. How about Windows Phone? No one's using Windows Phone. That's fine. No one's developing for Windows Phone. That's also fine. But yeah, Windows Phone has its own framework as well. I'd say there's probably about 5 or 6, depending on how you count them, different kinds of .NET frameworks. And there is the full .NET framework, which is what we're used to on the desktop. And that's the biggest one. But then there are subsets, like you have the Windows Runtime subset, which you can use from Windows Store applications. And you have Silverlight. You used to have Silverlight. Then you have Windows Phone, which is a subset. And you have Compact and Micro, of course, which is a subset. And there's a bunch of those subsets. And there's also a bunch of runtimes for these frameworks, for these subset frameworks. So you have the runtime used by the desktop CLR, which is also used by Windows Store. But you also have the Silverlight runtime, and you have the phone runtime. You have the .NET Native runtime, which is pretty interesting in itself. So there's a bunch of runtimes and there's a bunch of frameworks, and it's starting to get out of hand. And Microsoft realized that for a while now. In fact, you have a set of verticals. So you have totally unrelated verticals where you have an application model like the desktop, the phone, ASP.NET, what have you. And then you have the .NET framework for that specific vertical, and then you have a CLR. And again, that's getting out of hand. So what Microsoft is trying to do here is build a unified framework, which is .NET Core. And you know, they actually put it on the blog. There's this XKCD strip where they come up with a standard to end the proliferation of standards, and then you just have an extra standard, and that's all you got by inventing an extra standard. So here, Microsoft isn't trying to come up with another vertical. They're not trying to come up with another framework that some exotic part of the community is going to use. They are trying to unify things. They're trying to build a common foundation that will have application models on top. You will have ASP.NET on top of that common foundation with classes that aren't available for Windows Phone because they don't make sense on the Windows Phone. But you will not have system XML implemented 5 times across the different verticals. You will not have a garbage collector implemented 5 times across the different verticals. Now, obviously, they share a lot of code, but they start to diverge, and that's where things get bad, once they start to diverge. So we want a unified framework which has more than just system string, which has a bunch of interesting libraries, and we'll see exactly what it contains. I have a list. There is also an Excel, a huge Excel, with hundreds of thousands of methods, so you can see exactly what's in and what's out. And the runtime, the core CLR, anyway, which I've just mentioned, is also supposed to be a unified runtime, and there's little reason for, say, the Silverlight runtime and the phone runtime, the Windows Store and the desktop runtimes to be any different. There is still this little word, which is the .NET native runtime. It's different because it's a totally different distribution model, and it's native. But other than .NET native, let's just sort of try to ignore .NET native in this picture. We are supposed to have a single unified runtime and a single unified framework. And on top of that, application models. So in that .NET runtime, which I'm talking about, the core CLR, which is also called, it used to be known as the cloud optimized runtime. That was a good marketing code name, but it's totally meaningless, nothing to do with the cloud. So the core CLR, the .NET runtime, is the really low-level foundation of the class library, the low-level types in MS Core lib, the stuff that does interop, the stuff that calls into native methods. And then there's the GC, the just-in-time compiler, all kinds of low-level things that you think of as the runtime. Also metadata, app domains, runtime stuff. This unified class library, like I said, is a shared piece of code with stuff like system XML and threading and tasks and a bunch of other features. And there's no reason for this to be forked across the different verticals. And again, the application models could be, well, there's a lot of them already, but there could be new ones like Xbox and Xamarin and more in the future. But they all should be laid on top of this common foundation. So this is interesting, not crazy, super exciting, but interesting. And it has lots of implications for how you target shared, for how you build shared code that targets lots of different runtimes. Essentially, how you build PCLs now, and we'll get to that later. So what are the APIs in that .NET Core? Currently, on GitHub, and that's the sad part, there's only 25%, 25.2% of what Microsoft are planning to open source. So right now, you go to GitHub, you clone the repo, you get 25% of the APIs they're planning to eventually open source. If you look at the specifics, you'll see it's most of the .NET server stack. So it's not WinForms, it's not WPF, but it is server stuff like WCF, for example, like threading, like entity framework, SQL client, accessing databases, MEF, link, obviously, TPL, regex, XML, crypto, security, networking. It's all in. It's pretty much what you'd probably use in a server application today. So if you have your web application, for example, that's probably the .NET runtime, the .NET framework it uses today. If you have a WCF service, that's probably the .NET framework it uses today. For client apps, no. .NET Core does not have anything for client apps. It does not have an application model like WPF or WinForms, and it probably won't in the near future. So .NET Core is the core server stack. But again, for server applications, this subset is probably going to be enough. Now, there are some subtle reasons why right now Microsoft aren't going to open source WPF and WinForms and so on in this manner. It's mostly technical reasons. So it's, well, at least that's the way I see it. It's not like someone's protecting their super crazy intellectual property that's part of Windows Forms, and that's why they can't release it on GitHub. It's mostly technical reasons because WinForms is so dependent on a bunch of other things that are part of the OS. So trying to take this thing cross-platform, trying to take this thing open source and disconnect all these dependencies is simply not worth the while right now. Again, might change in the future, but right now, .NET Core is what you'd need for a server app and not what you'd probably need in a client app. Now, another incredible thing about this whole .NET Core model, which I hope to show you soon, is the way this thing is deployed. So how is the .NET Framework deployed today? Say the desktop one, which you have most control over, because the .NET Framework you have on your phone, for example, you have little control over. But the .NET Framework you have on your desktop, what's the deployment story there? Where do you get it from usually in the first place? Windows Update, and I'd say even before that, you usually get it with Windows. So you install Windows and you have some .NET Framework in the box. It started with Vista. Vista shipped with .NET Framework 3.0, and they kept shipping .NET as part of Windows. .NET 3.5 shipped with Windows 7, as far as I recall, and so on and so forth. Okay, and then you update through Windows Update, or you download as a user a .NET Framework installation package and install it, unlikely. Or an application can bundle in an installer for a particular version of the .NET Framework. So the model here is really that you have a system-wide install of .NET Framework, the CLR, just-in-time compiler, garbage collector, the whole bundle. In the .NET Core and Core CLR story, it's a bit different. So the .NET Core is now, and will be, a set of small NuGet packages. And I mean small. So not a NuGet package for link and TPL and parallel link and entity framework combined. I mean a NuGet package for collections, a NuGet package for immutable collections, a NuGet package for concurrent collections. Really well-factored pieces of functionality, and you can pick only what you need, and they can be versioned independently. So if there's no reason to update system XML, Microsoft can only update, say, TPL without affecting any existing XML code. So other than being small-ish NuGet packages, and by the way, the runtime itself is also going to be a small-ish NuGet package, you can also deploy these things up locally. So you can have multiple applications on the same machine, each with their own set of NuGet packages, each with their own set of versions, and they have absolutely no interaction with each other. So there is no system-wide installation anymore. Each application can ship with its own private .NET framework composed of the exact specific NuGet packages that application requires. So before we move on, what do you think about this? Do you have any reservations about this?
Interoperability.
What?
If you want to pass objects like between applications that target different NuGet packages, for example, that would be a problem.
Okay, so if you have multiple applications that talk to each other on the same machine and they have different versions of the .NET framework, this can be interesting. Although, I mean, if you had two applications that depend on different versions of the .NET framework installed on the same machine in the current model, it would also be pretty bad. Yeah. Okay, but what else?
Security patches?
Security patches, yes. And Microsoft do have a plan for distributing critical security patches to Windows Update anyway. Even though you're using app local deployment, they do have a plan for, in very specific critical cases, for breaking the promise and updating anyway. Probably not going to happen a lot, but for super critical security issues, they will consider that. Okay, yes?
Bloated installers.
What's that?
Bloated installers. I mean, these are fairly well packaged, like you say, but if you're sending out collections in 7.NET applications and you're making installers, you've got collections inside your installers 7 times.
Okay, yeah, and I'd say on tablets, for example, the space is going to be pretty, the space consumption is going to be pretty bad. Yeah, so you will have duplication. What else? Okay, so that's for the reservations, and you're totally right, and I agree, but I think the pros really are more significant. Pretty much everyone is realizing that shared common deployment is a bad idea. Windows, by the way, realized it a few years ago. Windows also had, at some point, this crazy thing called side-by-side deployment and shared DLLs for native code, I mean. And they slowly moved away from that. And at this point, Microsoft is moving away from that with .NET as well. So .NET Core is going to be app private, app local, NuGet packages. You only deploy what you need. And a lot of apps, by the way, will not need any extra NuGet packages except for the runtime and maybe a couple of others. It means the 400 megabyte desktop.NET installation becomes maybe 20 megabytes of NuGet packages you actually need. And another thing, you take dependencies on specific versions of specific packages, which means you can update these dependencies whenever you want. So you can say, I do want the new TPL, but I don't want the new XML, and I don't want the new concurrent collections because I don't care about the features they added here. And obviously, there's also gonna be, at some point, compatibility issues between different packages working together. But Microsoft and the contributors to the .NET Core are going to work very hard to make sure that you can use an older package of A with a newer package of B and them not breaking each other. And that's, by the way, the case with the .NET Framework today already. They have very, very strict guidelines for maintaining backwards compatibility. Okay, so we've got deployment covered. Now, what happens to the desktop.NET Framework in this whole story? Notice that .NET Core does not contain every component that the desktop framework contains, such as WinForms, WPF, for example. And the .NET desktop framework isn't dead. Okay, it's still going to be there. It's still going to be deployed through Windows Update. The next version of the .NET Framework is .NET Framework 4.6. And again, stuff like WinForms and WPF and COM+, that's all going to be in the .NET Framework, the desktop framework, for a while now. And even though it is not open source, even though you cannot compile your own, it is kind of open in terms of being readable. You do have read access to the full .NET Framework's source code. It is not new. It's called reference source. It's now a nicer website, and I'll show you that nicer website. But you can't download this thing, compile it, deploy it. You can only read the source. So here's reference source. If you haven't seen the new reference source experience, you really should check it out. It's much nicer than a big zip file with a bunch of source files, which is what they used to have at some point. So it's a browsable thing with hyperlinks, by the way, powered by the Roslyn platform. So, for example, I could go and search for class XML document, and then it finds me the class. And a few seconds later, or at some point, I have the class XML document show up on the right. And this isn't some auto-generated code. This is the actual original source code for that version of the .NET Framework, including ugly comments and to-do and fix-me, which you can find if you look for it carefully. So again, this is not what people would call open source. It's just the source is there and you can read it. You cannot modify it. You cannot contribute changes. You cannot even build this thing into your own .NET Framework. But that's what you get for the desktop.NET. What the .NET Core looks like I'll show you soon, and that's fully compilable, testable, and all these scenarios are supported. So reference source, just wanted to tell you about it so that you know. Now the .NET Desktop framework, like I said, it's alive, it's going to be versioned, there will be new releases. For example, there's a whole team working on WPF now. WPF used to be in super maintenance mode, which means there wasn't lots of effort invested in WPF. But there is now. There is a team and there's a bunch of features on the backlog, and there will be a new release of WPF at some point, which is great. And that's going to be part of the .NET Desktop framework, say .NET 4.7 or 5.0 or whatever. The .NET Core will probably version a lot faster. .NET Framework usually is released once a year, sometimes a little less. .NET Core will probably have some kind of update every couple of weeks or so, maybe even less. You have a bunch of independent NuGet packages, a bunch of teams and external contributors working on them, so you'll have releases much more often. So it's a quite different story. Microsoft, by the way, are planning to take a bunch of different NuGet packages, a bunch of different versions, and call that an official distribution, where they have been more rigorously tested together than just a random collection of versions and packages. But still, even that will probably be released much more often than the official huge desktop framework. All right, now what happens to the other runtimes before I show you a couple of demos? What happens to Windows Phone, for example? Windows Store and Windows Phone, actually. So currently, both the Windows Store and the Windows Phone .NET runtimes and .NET frameworks are a subset of .NET Core. Now, they do have an application model on top, the XAML stuff, the wrappers for the operating system stuff, like contracts and search and geolocation. That's obviously going to stay and is not going to be part of .NET Core. But collections, XML, threading, tasks, files, serialization, that's all already a subset of .NET Core. So going forward, that same .NET Core is going to power Windows Phone and Windows Store applications as well. And the runtime is going to be shared as well. It is already the same runtime for desktop and Windows Store. It is not currently the same runtime for phone, but it will be the same runtime for all three at some point in the future. And ASP.NET 5 as well is going to use the same runtime. So you'll have the same runtime from website running on servers and phones running in your pocket. So that's for Windows Phone. Now, the whole cross-platform story kind of also raises the question of what's going to happen to the Mana project. And Mana is a pretty solid implementation of both the .NET Framework and the CLR for Linux and Mac. And it works pretty fine on those platforms. So Mono isn't going away, and there is in fact collaboration between Microsoft and Xamarin on, and also the Mono project in general, on how to take this forward. So right now, Mono has lots of classes, lots of features which aren't part of .NET Core. For example, Mono has a Windows Forms implementation, which works on Linux and Mac. So going forward, probably the core parts that are already part of .NET Core will be merged into Mono. So instead of having their own system XML implementation, Mono is going to use Microsoft's. Instead of using their own garbage collector, Mono is going to use Microsoft's. That's going to take a while. It's not going to happen this year probably, although people are already working on it. But again, the idea is that if you can take that unified class library and that great runtime and just put it on another platform and then build stuff on top, build an application model on top, then why not? The more shared stuff we have, the better. And Mono is probably committed to doing that. Another question before we take a look at some code is what happens to portable class libraries? So what do you think? Say I want to target a bunch of different .NET Core platforms. I want to build a library that works on Windows, that works on ASP.NET on Linux, that works on phone, and at some point in the future, they're all using .NET Core. So what does it mean for my library? What do you think?
It could be used on any platform.
Yeah, so I don't have to do anything extra. If I target .NET Core, then my stuff works on any .NET Core platform, yes. And there's a pretty big smiley here. So you can, if you target .NET Core, you can build portable libraries which run on ASP.NET, on Windows, on the phone, maybe on Xbox one day, on the desktop, of course, on Linux or Mac. And it's not by virtue of some special configuration and restricting yourself to certain subsets of APIs. You target the .NET Core, that's the .NET version, that's the .NET framework you target, and it's just supported on so many wonderful platforms. So more and more libraries will be portable class libraries. You probably wouldn't, maybe in a year or two, you wouldn't have to think so hard about making stuff portable, making a portable class library. You target .NET Core by default, and it's just portable by itself. If you share code with non-.NET Core platforms, say Windows Phone 7 or Silverlight and so on, then obviously you'd still need PCLs. You'd still need portable class libraries that restrict you to the common subset. But going forward, in a few years, we'll see a model where pretty much everything is portable, and as much as possible, you just target .NET Core and not use any application model features which your shared library doesn't need. So that's also going to be a pretty good thing. Now, before I show you some code, I'd just like to explain how the projects are organized and what sits where. So you could say there's two key projects which we're talking about here in this session, and that's Core CLR and Core FX. These are two open source projects on GitHub. Core CLR is the runtime, garbage collector, just-in-time compiler, metadata, app domains. MS Core lib is part of Core CLR as well. So that's all the low-level stuff. And there's lots of native code there, some like 2 million lines of native code. Core FX is pure C#, that's libraries, that's the .NET Core. That's what they call the .NET Core. And that's just the unified libraries which should be available on every platform. So again, XML, TPL, WCF, and so on. I should mention that there's a lot more open source stuff on GitHub from Microsoft right now. Roslyn itself, there's a whole ASP.NET organization which has SignalR, ASP.NET, MVC, NT-Framework, a bunch of other projects under that umbrella. But Core CLR and Core FX are the ones we're talking about here. So let me just quickly open Core FX, for example. Okay, so that's Core FX. And what I wanted to show you is just the pulse for that repo. So over the last week, 55 active pull requests, of which 47 have been merged, 40 new issues, of which 24 have been closed, 81 commits over the last week, not that many, but still a considerable amount. And if you look at the contributors, most of them at this point are still Microsoft employees, of course, but there are some external contributions, and I have a little list I'll show you later. If we go to Core CLR, pretty similar story, Core Runtime, Core CLR, and if we look at the pulse, 51 active pull requests over the last week, 31 active issues, 60 commits over the last week, and again, a bunch of authors, many of them, again, Microsoft employees, but this is slowly changing, and there's a bunch of key contributions to Core CLR already by community members. Okay, so these are the projects. Just to give you a quick look at the source, and I'll have a couple of demos where we build our own. So I've got the two repos cloned here, Core FX and Core CLR. So Core FX source just has a bunch of sources for .NET assemblies. This will eventually be the NuGet packages that I'm talking about. So each of those will be a NuGet package. So you've got, like I said, collections and concurrent collections and immutable collections, and so on and so forth. And this is all C#. On the Core CLR side, under source, you'll find most of the folders contain C++ code. For example, GC, garbage collection, I've said, just-in-time compiler. These are all native components, but there is also MS Core lib in here, which is mostly C# It's a Visual Studio project, by the way. The whole thing is just Visual Studio projects and C# code inside. Now, Microsoft have made it pretty much as easy as possible to compile this thing on Windows, on Linux, on Mac, with minimal effort, so you don't have to, understand all the little intricacies of their project structure. But at the end of the day, it's Visual Studio projects. It's not some contrived build system. It's Visual Studio. It's MS Build, and the build scripts you get, they just run MS Build. So, for example, over here, I ran a build of Core CLR. I'm actually not going to do it now because I need that. I need the products. And the Core CLR build takes 25 minutes or so. 2 million lines of C++. That's perfectly reasonable. The Core FX build is a little shorter, but there's a bunch of code to be built here. But basically, for example, for Core CLR, you just run build. And all you need for that is Visual Studio installed on your machine. For the Core FX build, same thing. There's a build script. And to build this on Mac, I'll show you the products soon. To build this on Mac, again, you have a build script that you run. So you can start experimenting with this pretty quickly. And I'll show you an example of a change we made to MS Core Lib, compile this thing, run it, debug it, so show the whole workflow. Before I do that, though, I do want to convince you that you might want to consider contributing or at least getting involved in some way in either of those interesting community projects. So why do you think, is anyone here already interested in contributing? Do we have maybe interesting ideas for why and what you can add to this project? Yes?
Bug fixes.
Hmm?
Bug fixes.
Bug fixes, that would be great, yes. Now, CLR bugs can be pretty hard to find and fix, but bugs in the framework happen pretty often, and yep, you can now fix them. Or at least, at the very least, you can debug them down to the source in Visual Studio like you would any project of your own, and that's pretty great. Okay, what else? Does anyone have this killer feature that they always wanted in the .NET framework and now they can build? Yeah, I know it's not very realistic, but actually my wife gave me a great idea last week. She's also a software developer, and she was like, she does WPF a lot, she used to. And she was like, why does key not found exception not tell me the name of the key that wasn't found? So you try to look up a key in a dictionary, and it throws an exception, and it says a key was not found in a dictionary, but it doesn't say which key. And it could be so nice if it did. So that's what I'm going to show you later. I've added that to key not found exception. Not contributed it back because they don't want it in the framework. There are some reasons, never mind. But I'll show you that we can actually make this kind of change and build our own CLR. Another example I personally wanted for a while was direct control over priorities of tasks in the TPL. You have control over thread priorities. You don't have so much control over task priorities. So there's a bunch of little features like that that you could contribute back to the project, or worst case, fork and use with your own implementation. Bugs, obviously, some of you have mentioned. And another thing, the design and implementation of .NET Core and Core CLR is now in the open as well. So, I mean, we're not going to be part of every little community decision, of every little, implementation decision, obviously, but there will be much more effect for our collective opinions, and we already have, there already are features in Core CLR which were contributed by people just like you and me, not Microsoft employees in any way. The contribution process, by the way, is pretty simple. You create an issue, you discuss your proposed feature, bug fix, maintenance work with the repo owner, and they're very quick to respond. They try to close issues in a matter of hours because it's really, at least for now, a very high priority for them to engage with us, to engage with the community. You fork, you implement, you test, you commit, you issue a pull request. Again, usually in a matter of days, they are either approved or you get feedback. And finally, before your code ends up in the .NET framework we all love, you have to sign a contribution license agreement, which basically says you're not going to sue Microsoft for using your contributed source code. It's a 2-minute process, this CLA. So that's what you have to do to contribute. Is it really that easy to contribute? So again, some features are, some features aren't. I'm going to show you the keynote found exception demo in a minute. But first, here are some real examples from last week's Core FX and Core CLR contributions. So here's one that's totally boring, number 1154. There was a build warning in this one particular file, and so someone fixed that warning by putting a pragma warning around it. Amazing. But I mean, it helps someone out there. It obviously helps improve the quality of the product, and that's an incredible thing that we can actually contribute this kind of fixes. Another thing, make environment keys in the process start info class case insensitive on Windows, which should be the case because environment variables are case sensitive on Windows everywhere else. So this is a real bug, and someone fixed that bug. Core CLR had pretty incredible contributions, and one from last week is support for OpenBSD. Now, it says initial support, which means it compiles and runs a hello world, but it does so on OpenBSD, which is not a platform Microsoft originally deployed for. Now, it's not like someone just ported 2 million lines of code. It's pretty portable code in the first place, which is why it was fairly reasonable to support OpenBSD. Another really huge community contribution from about a month and a half ago, I think February, is OS X support. Just days after the code was dropped on GitHub, this gentleman, Jeff Norton, contributed OS X support. So you can compile Core CLR on the Mac. You can run simple applications on the Mac using Core CLR. And here's an example of this. So I have here, let me go back to the project folder. This is the Core CLR repo on my Mac. And there's a build shell script for OS X and Linux. There's also build CMD for Windows. The build, again, takes some 20 minutes or so and change. And when the build completes, you get a bunch of files. Core run is the console runner, a command line tool that runs .NET applications on Core CLR. You have Core Run for Windows, Core Run exe. You have Core Run for Linux and Mac. It's just Core Run, no extension. It's part of the build. It's produced by the build. You get lib Core CLR, which is 23 megs, and that's the big chunk of code. That's the .NET runtime, the CLR, garbage collector, JIT, all of the above. You get the MS Core DAC and SOS, which are debugging components. They're not required for routine operation. And finally, you need MS Core libDLL to run any .NET applications. And at this point, the build process does not support building MS Core lib on Mac or Linux. So you have to build it on Windows and copy it over to your Mac, which is in itself a pretty incredible feat that you can build it on Windows and use it on Mac or Linux. So you build it on Windows, you copy it over, and then these files here are what you need to run your application. Now, I have this really simple, stupid demo, so just to show you that it works. This is hello CS, and it creates a thread, prints something, and then prints something else, just to show you some basic APIs. These are all in MS Core lib, and you compile this thing now, so I have hello CS, but to compile it, you need a C# compiler. Now, where do we get a C# compiler, or where from, yeah? Where do we get a C# compiler from for Linux and Mac? What's that? I'm sorry? Mono compiler, yeah. Well, that's cheating, but unfortunately, Unfortunately, mono is what you have to resort to because Roslyn which is what I hoped you'd say. Roslyn, which is supposed to be cross-platform at some point, is not yet. So you can't build Roslyn for Mac and Linux. So at this point, yeah, you gotta have to use Mono. So DMCS is the Mono compiler, and no standard library, but reference my MS core lib and take my hello CS and produce an executable. And so now we have a hello exe, and we can run it with core run. And hopefully it works and prints stuff from one thread and from the other thread and waits for console input and exits. Now, you can't possibly you can't possibly start to run production applications like this. No, it's nowhere near ready. I even have a slide that says, no, don't do it. But it's incredibly impressive. You have Microsoft, open source, cross-platform, GC, just-in-time compiler, MS Core lib, all running on the Mac, thanks to a contribution from the community just a few days after the project was open sourced. I didn't think we'd live to see this day, but we did. Yeah, taking a picture. Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so that's for compiling on OS X and all. The cross-platform, yeah, okay, I think I'll show you the other demo as well at this point. So the key not found exception thing. I really wanted to sort of include the key that wasn't found in the key not found exception. So here's what I did, and I mean, anyone could. So this is the MS Core lib project in Visual Studio, and it's part of Core CLR as well. It's not part of Core FX. MS Core lib specifically is part of the runtime, not part of the base class library. And so I opened it and just sort of searched for the dictionary source code and found that dictionary, when a key isn't found, calls a helper called throw helper, throw key not found exception, but it doesn't pass on the key which wasn't found. So this is just the indexer for dictionary, and it used to just call a helper that threw an exception. So I changed this to take the key from the indexer. And then in that throw helper, this is what it used to be calling. It used to call throw key not found, which just throws a new key not found exception. Don't ask me why they have a helper that throws an exception, but they do. So anyway, that's what it used to be. Now I wanted it to throw an exception with the key inside. So I took key not found exception, and I added a property called key, which can be set when I create the exception object. And then in the throw helper, my new method, throw key not found exception for key, creates a key not found exception, assigns to the key that failed to be found, and throws that. Now, the reason I split it here is because I, at some point, discovered that to put a string of my own as an exception message, MS Core lib uses this concept of a kind of like string resources, but in a very primitive way. They have this huge text file, which looks like this, where they have resource keys and resource values for those keys. That's for localization, obviously, for translating the .NET framework and MS Core lib into multiple languages. And so I had to take, I had to duplicate and put my own key in here. Our key not found with key now is a resource name for this string. And so this is what the, this is what the throw helper now does. It gets this resource string, puts the key in there, formats the string, and throws the exception. And then I built, and it took 25 minutes, and then it didn't build, but never mind. Eventually it built, and so right over here, I have the products from that. So this is the Windows build of Core CLR. Now again, Core CLR DLL, that's the key runtime. That's the runtime itself, GC, JIT, and so on. Core Run is that console runner, which I've already mentioned, and it's pretty nice. Hello CS and hello exe is my application. And then we have the DAC here, which is a debugging component. We have SOS, which is a debugging component. And we have mscorelib, which is really the only thing I've changed. So this is my changed new mscorelib. And there's symbols for everything, so you can debug this in Visual Studio. Now, my console app, here's what it does. It creates a dictionary, and it tries to access a key that isn't there. So let me try and run this thing. Core run hello exe. Okay, it takes a long time to initialize, but it's a debug build. And it's a lot slower than anything. And then it fails. And the exception message is the given key A was not present in the dictionary. That's all I wanted. That's all I wanted to accomplish. And so we get the new exception message, and the thing obviously stops working. There was an unhandled exception. Now, at some point in the near future, namely when Visual Studio 2015 is released, we'll be able to, at this point, just click debug the program and open this thing up in Visual Studio, and we'll have the custom CLR and mscorelib and all available for stepping. At this point, unfortunately, you can only debug in Visual Studio the native parts, the unmanaged parts. So not the changes I made to mscorelib, but just changes I could make to the runtime itself. Again, this limitation is going away, but currently it means that to verify everything's crashing properly, I had to use an alternative debugger, and I just used WinDBG for that. And so let me just quickly attach to this core run process. Sorry, WinDBG occasionally has this thing where it starts duplicating every single thing you type. So attach to core run. Okay. Let me just, sorry, this is a virtual machine and I haven't configured fonts in advance. Really sorry. Font 18 should be fine. Oh my. I hope you can all read this. Yes? Yes? Okay. So this is WinDBG, and now what I'm going to do is configure symbols, and my folder where this whole binary thing was compiled into is right over here, and that's where I have private symbols for the CLR build we just built. So for instance, I have core CLR, sorry, I have mscorelib DLL and mscorelib PDB over here. So I'm going to tell my debugger to use this folder as well as part of my symbol path. And now, in WinDBG, to actually see the managed exception that occurred, we need a helper, which is also part of the build, called SOS. And I bet some of you have heard about WinDBG and SOS working together. But the interesting part is that if you build your own CLR, you're going to have to build your own SOS as well. So I load SOS from that build folder as well. And now we have our own CLR, our own .NET framework, well, mscorelib anyway, and our own SOS in the debugger. And so I can go to the right thread and ask SOS to print the exception. And this is a command from that custom SOS build. And that says that we had a key not found exception, and the message is the given key A was not present in the dictionary. And the exception object is right over here, so I could use another SOS command to dump that exception object itself in more detail. And towards the end here, it has this key property which we added in Visual Studio. And if we look at that key, you can see it's the string A. So the exception message says that it was the key A, and the exception object also has a field called key, which you could use if you wanted access to the non-existent key when catching the exception. So that's kind of what we wanted. Okay, so it even worked, this whole thing, which is pretty surprising. But then again, I used the canned binaries. I didn't run the whole build. But now that it worked, I can start a build just to give you an idea of what it looks like. I'm going to quit and detach here, shut this thing down, open that original command prompt, and just run build again. And again, it's a totally automated process, just kind of runs, builds, and eventually produces a bunch of binaries. On the Mac, it actually has colored, oh, here it is colored as well. Yeah, so it's got some colors in the process. Great. On the Mac, by the way, it's using CMake and not MS-Build. So I can also launch a Mac build just for kicks. Let's go to the core CLR folder and do a build sh. Oh, sorry. Do a build sh. Yep, so detected OS X, x86, 64, configuring, and it's going to start building now. Okay, so that was just a little experimentation with core CLR, MS Core Lib, the whole thing. Let's just answer a few more questions to wrap this thing up. So, what's the cross-platform story? What are we getting out of being able to run Core FX, Core CLR, and so on other platforms? Where are things standing right now? So first, we have ASP.NET 5. And ASP.NET 5 presently runs on Windows with .NET Framework, the desktop one, or .NET Core. This support has only been around for a few weeks, but there is now support for running ASP.NET on Windows on top of the .NET Core and Core CLR that we just experimented with. On other platforms, at this point, ASP.NET does not support Core CLR. So for example, on Linux and Mac, it can run on top of Mono. So ASP.NET is an application model in terms of the partitioning we did previously, and that application model on Windows already supports .NET Core, and on Linux it will support .NET Core at some point in the future on Linux and the Mac. Right now it runs on Mono, and there was a great talk today, I think, about ASP.NET on other platforms. The .NET Core itself and the Core CLR, we already saw have some initial Linux and Mac support. Core CLR builds and runs, as you saw, pretty well on Mac. Core FX presently does not build on Linux and Mac, but it does have all the necessary work in place for this to be enabled pretty soon. Roslyn, which is another piece of the puzzle we've mentioned, the compiler platform, will soon have support for Linux and OS X. And that means at some point in the not so distant future, you'll be able to do all your .NET development, including building your own CLR and making changes to the .NET framework and to the compiler toolchain and to ASP.NET, all the parts of the pipeline on other platforms, not just Windows. So Windows is at some point going to be totally separate from other platforms. Currently, you still need Windows to build some key parts, or you need help from external components like Mono. So that's the cross-platform thing. Now, just a few things before I open it up for questions. I personally felt when this whole thing was announced that if we had .NET Core, Core CLR, all this stuff, open source and on other platforms in 2001, Java wouldn't be where it is today. I mean, I do Java occasionally. I do Java on Android mostly. And I don't hate it, but I prefer C# still. And just think about having today, for 15 years now really, a cross-platform, fully mature .NET and CLR on Linux, Mac, and Windows. Obviously, Microsoft didn't do it in 2001, but if they did that then, I think we wouldn't need Java anymore at this point. Anyway, I wouldn't. Another thing about stability, which I already mentioned. This thing is totally unstable. It doesn't even always build in some of my experiments. So no, you can't run your production applications using this whole thing just yet, using this platform. But it's a great thing for experimentation. If you always wanted to know how this and that part of the runtime worked, you can now. And for example, I have a really strong interest in garbage collection, and I've been doing some reading of the GC sources recently, 55,000 lines of GC source, so I'm working my way through that. Major takeaways just before you ask your questions and we discuss this whole thing. .NET Core, this magical thing that was announced in November, is a server subset of the full .NET framework, which is designed to run on all platforms and unify all of these verticals. The .NET and CLR for Windows Phone, the .NET and CLR for Silverlight, the .NET and CLR for Windows Store. No more. We want a single unified runtime, a single unified .NET framework, and then on top of that, tiny, teeny little application models for ASP.NET or XAML or Silverlight or, well, not Silverlight, but maybe Windows Phone. And that's becoming a reality pretty soon. Plus it's open source, plus it runs on other platforms, which is pretty cool. Other key thing is that the whole thing has been refactored into NuGet packages. I haven't shown you this because it's really not there yet to show, but at some point you'll be able to create a solution and pick precisely the .NET Core NuGet packages which you need for that project, including specific versions. So I want this version of System.xml and that version of WCF and that version of the TPL and nothing else, please, so no other dependencies. And this whole thing is going to version separately and no global installation of the .NET framework required. And lastly, I think this whole thing is, hinges on community participation. If we help, even by forking the project just to experiment, starring it on GitHub, making maybe one comment in one forum, in one thread, in one discussion, if each and every one of us helps just a little, this thing is going to move forward much faster and this thing is going to succeed. And I think many of us should want this thing to succeed. We're not tied to a single platform anymore. We love open source. We love contribution. We love being able to look at the internals of this thing. So even if you don't contribute a major feature like port core CLR to, I don't know, to your car, you're still able to make even a small difference. And I really hope some of you participate and show me what you did next year. So I'll be happy to take any questions. I know there's a lot to digest, and it's kind of .NET Core this, Core CLR that. This works on Windows, this doesn't. This is on Linux. Here you need Mono, there you need Roslyn. I realize it's a mess right now, and it is. But I think you can already experiment and do some pretty awesome things with these bits. So please, I'd be happy to take any questions at this point. Yes?
So currently with .NET, executables will magically spin up, magically invoke the framework when you execute them.
Which executable would magically...
So if you compile using compile your hello world, and you run your executable on Windows, you don't have to...
No, you need the core run runner anyway. Yes, no, you need the core run runner anyway. The MS core lib that you build with, it's not compatible with the desktop MS core lib and with the desktop assemblies, so no. And in fact, I deliberately only made changes to MS core lib because that meant I didn't have to compile core effects and bring in assemblies from there. They only work together, yeah, right now anyway. Okay, yes?
Have you contributed anything other than your...
Not yet. Like I said, my wife suggested this keynote found exception thing, and I hope she contributes it. But seriously though, there were some discussions on this keynote found exception thing, and the feedback I got, not me personally, but feedback people got was that the key could have a very complex string representation, and so they don't want to put it in the message by default, blah, blah, blah. Some reasons about backwards compatibility as well. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that, by the way, is fixable, but it's a lot harder. That would require changes to the just-in-time compiler to keep track of... I mean, I assume you want to know which thing was null when you get a null reference exception, right? Just getting in front of myself. Yeah, so that would be hard because you need somehow at runtime to get this from the compiler, figure out which thing was null. It's doable. It's a pretty cool idea. Yeah. Yep.
Do you think Microsoft will start some kind of independent foundation to own this and take it forwards? Because coming from the Java world, which is mainly where I spend my time, when some ran into trouble, or it's not Java community rather than product developers.
Uh-huh.
So I wonder if one of the things Microsoft could do is give the community.
Thank you for asking this.
What is that?
Yeah, thank you for asking this. So yeah, the .NET Foundation is an independent organization to foster open development and a collaboration around the .NET development framework, blah, blah, blah. At this point, however, .NET Foundation is an organization that is supposed to push .NET and open source forward. Currently, the main contributors, collaborators there are Xamarin and Microsoft. Xamarin obviously have a big interest in putting C# and .NET on a bunch of platforms and getting stuff from Microsoft in return. So yeah, this thing is in place, and it's unclear who's going to be involved exactly and how. Obviously, for the next year, 2, maybe 5, it's still going to be a Microsoft thing. And I mean, Java for some people still means sun. But yeah, there's an attempt to make this more than just Microsoft. I really hope it becomes more than just Microsoft. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How do you see the relationship between Microsoft and Xamarin changing? I mean, isn't there the risk for Xamarin that they could easily, in a blink of an eye, see their business model just completely destroyed?
Yeah, well, it's not really. Microsoft are not, at this point, doing anything to bring Core CLR and .NET Core to iOS and Android. Xamarin have a pretty mature runtime, which works on iOS and Android. It also works on other platforms like the Mac and Windows also, by the way, Mono. I think it's gonna work because Xamarin have lots of added value on top of the runtime. Even if at some point they take .NET Core and Core CLR and just put that on iOS and Android, they still have API wrappers, they still have development tools, they still have application model components, Xamarin Forms, and so on and so forth. Might be a shift they'll make at some point because, for instance, the garbage collector in Mono on Linux, for example, is really not up to par with the desktop one that Microsoft have for Windows. But I mean, time will tell. I really hope that nothing bad comes out of this relationship for the tools we already have. Okay. Yes.
How far have things got with the more different frameworks? Like I'm thinking of
The what?
like the frameworks that are more different. So I'm thinking of phone and micro framework,
Mm-hmm.
which obviously going to be much harder to do this one.
Yeah. So micro framework doesn't really have a runtime.
No, it's interpreted, isn't it? Which is, it's interpreted at the moment, which is going to make
Yeah, it's a little different, and Compact Framework does have a runtime, and it's a pretty different runtime because it's designed for other operating systems. I don't know if we're going to see a sudden surge of interest in Micro and Compact, and Microsoft may be doing something about it. Right now, though, Core CLR is not planned to, transition to this kind of devices, to micro devices or to embedded devices.
I thought your first slide said it was.
Hmm?
I thought your first slide said Core CLR was spanning everything.
Well, everything that's currently, every major runtime that's currently supported. For example, Silverlight is another runtime, and Core CLR is not going to power Silverlight because there will be absolutely no investment in Silverlight ever. But the ones that Microsoft is investing in right now, which is phone, Windows, probably Xbox, Linux, Mac, the plan is to have this common runtime. Micro and Compact haven't been in active development recently. So if at any point there will be, again, a new version, I expect it to be based on .NET Core. But I don't see, I don't see how the micro framework, for example, would have TPL support or WCF support. I'm just not sure it's, Yeah. Okay. So you had some excellent questions. If you have anything else you'd like to discuss in private, then please go ahead and ask. I'm just going to put up my contact details again. I'd love to stay in touch if you have any questions or anything else you'd like to discuss. I hope you enjoy the last session and any workshops tomorrow. See you next year anyway. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Managed Extensibility Framework is open source for a few years now. The Azure SDK client libraries in C#, Python, and JavaScript, they are all open source on GitHub for a while. The Roslyn compiler platform and the C# and VB compilers are open source for a few months now. Used to be on Codeplex, they are now on GitHub. And here's the recent announcement. MS Build has been open source for a week and a half now. Not the most exciting piece of software they could open source, but it's nice to have. And the Windows Driver Foundation is open source now on GitHub. And that's by a totally different team on a totally different side of Microsoft, and it's also going open source. So the Windows kernel is not open source. The Windows operating system is not open source. But Windows Driver Framework is a pretty important component which used to be obviously closed, and Microsoft just recently announced that they are open sourcing it as well. And I think this also aligns with things we've been seeing over the last few years, where Microsoft has sort of started to connect to the open source community and connect to the community in general. For instance, if you look at Azure, Microsoft have Linux support on Azure for a while, for Linux virtual machines, but only during the last 2 or 3 years, they really care about this support. And by really care, I mean they want people to use Linux. They want people to use Linux and not Windows. I mean, they wouldn't mind if you used Windows and paid the extra licensing fees, but they really don't mind if you use Linux for everything. And you can run Java on Azure websites, for example, for quite a few months now. Another example of trying to be open and often succeeding. And so, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. This is my last talk at DevWeek for now. I hope you've been enjoying everything so far. It's, I think, a pretty good idea that they kept this talk for last. It kind of helps build closure for this conference and prepare the ground for the next one, where we're probably going to be talking a lot about what it means for .NET, the new open source era for .NET, .NET Core, Core CLR, where Microsoft is going. It's all very, very early now. And I hope to give you some ground for exploration in the coming year. And then I'll see you here in March next year. And hopefully you'll be able to share some very cool stuff that you built on top of this new open sourced .NET. The title is an open source .NET, and I built this as a story of 19 questions and answers. They're not all particularly exciting, these questions, but the answers are pretty interesting. And I also have a few demos which were rather hard to build, showing how we can take the bits Microsoft just put on GitHub, compile, build, test, and run our own .NET, our own CLR, our own diagnostic tools for that CLR. And that's all very, very exciting, but it's also very, very early, like I said. So if anything goes wrong, it's not even preview software. It's much earlier than preview. So it couldn't be more raw than it is right now. That's just the early warning. My name is Sasha Goldshtein. Some of you have already been at one of my talks earlier. And if you'd like to stay in touch, then please feel free to ask any questions during the session, afterwards. Shoot me an email, follow me on Twitter, read my blog. I expect to do a lot around. So this whole open source thing just fits really well into that movement, and MEF was sort of the pioneer there. Glenn Block, who's formerly of Microsoft, worked a lot on making Microsoft a better place for open source and for taking community contributions. Now, I mentioned that .NET Core is not exactly what you'd probably think of when you say .NET Framework. And so what I'd like to ask you now is there really such a thing, a .NET Framework, the .NET Framework? What does it really mean, a .NET Framework? Maybe there are multiple .NET Frameworks. Can you give me a few? Does anyone have more than one .NET Framework in mind? Yes?
Micro framework?
So we have the .NET Micro framework, and we have the desktop framework, I suppose, for the other. What's that?
And compact.
Compact framework as well. Yep. How about Windows Phone? No one's using Windows Phone. That's fine. No one's developing for Windows Phone. That's also fine. But yeah, Windows Phone has its own framework as well. I'd say there's probably about 5 or 6, depending on how you count them, different kinds of .NET frameworks. And there is the full .NET framework, which is what we're used to on the desktop. And that's the biggest one. But then there are subsets, like you have the Windows Runtime subset, which you can use from Windows Store applications. And you have Silverlight. You used to have Silverlight. Then you have Windows Phone, which is a subset. And you have Compact and Micro, of course, which is a subset. And there's a bunch of those subsets. And there's also a bunch of runtimes for these frameworks, for these subset frameworks. So you have the runtime used this open source .NET stuff in the coming year. So the first question is, what am I talking about? What open source .NET? If you have been living under a rock for the last 5 months, you might have missed the important announcements. And so in November, Microsoft announced that they are open sourcing .NET Core, which is something that never existed, so it was kind of weird that they open sourced it. But they made up a product called .NET Core, and then they announced they're going to open source it. And they made up another product called Core CLR and announced they're going to open source that as well. Now, the .NET Core is something you might think of as the .NET framework, but I will explain that it's not quite the same thing you're used to calling the .NET desktop framework. And Core CLR is the runtime for that framework. And again, it's not quite what you know today as the desktop CLR, the one you have on your desktop. It's not just open source, though, that was interesting in this announcement. Microsoft also announced that they are planning to invest resources on building both .NET Core and Core CLR on other platforms, so bringing it to Linux, bringing it to OS X, and to other platforms potentially as well. So not just releasing this thing and letting other people take care of porting, but actually investing their own resources in porting .NET Core and Core CLR to other platforms. And in fact, as you'll see today, the Microsoft-enabled support is pretty much enough to compile, build, and run your own CLR on OS X, and that's exactly what I'm planning to do. There is also already some community involvement, which I'll talk about later. So people are getting interested, people are contributing code, and Microsoft are taking that code and using it. So it's not your typical move by Microsoft when they take a huge chunk of code and just drop it to GitHub twice a year, or drop it to Codeplex, more reasonably, drop it to Codeplex twice a year. It's a totally different approach this time. And they're actually making commits in the open. So you can see, as the day progresses in Redmond, you can see multiple commits pile up. There are branches that you can see visible in the open. Feature work is happening on those branches. So it's not a project where once a year someone drops new 200,000 lines of code that you have to go through. And from that perspective, it is in fact more open than almost anything Microsoft has done before. And they're planning to keep it up that way. The other thing is that, like I've said, it's truly cross-platform, so they're not really just dropping support for dropping code with support for Windows and expecting people to take care of other platforms. They are, like I said, actively investing in other platforms. And finally, it's really community-driven, so they are expecting people to contribute. And obviously, at this point, most work on the CLR and the .NET Core is by Microsoft developers, but it isn't by any means a closed community. And people are expected to contribute, and they have been. And I'll show you some really interesting contributions along the way. Is this the first time Microsoft has ever done open source, or is this like a totally new experiment for them? What do you think? No. What's that? What's that?
SignalR.
SignalR was open sourced, okay. Anything even earlier, maybe? When was ASP.NET MVC open sourced? It was. And it was open sourced a while ago. ASP.NET MVC 4 was open sourced. Entity Framework 6 is open source. MEF